Epilepsy warning for flashing lights and colors. Merry Christmas, everyone, and if it's not Christmas by the time you're watching this, then Merry other day of the year. Today, I figured that the perfect Christmas gift for you, the viewers, would be a surprise dark ride video. And once again, we'll be discussing dark rides that many people, including myself until recently, haven't heard of. In fact, some of these dark rides were suggested by viewers, so big thanks for pointing these out to me. Now, ordinarily, I would rank these in a viewer poll, but since many of my viewers most likely haven't heard of them, I feel like it wouldn't be fair to have people who haven't heard of them vote on them until I at least tell them what they're about. So consider this to be one of many dark ride introductory videos. But with that said, let's get started at Holiday World in Indiana. You may have heard of the recently opened Good Gravy coaster, you know, that gravy boat train coaster, but they actually already have a Thanksgiving dark ride. This ride is called Gobbler Getaway, and the plot is similar to Good Gravy, but instead of the gravy going missing, the turkeys have gone missing. So the story of this ride is basically, you're a farmer and you have to get the turkeys back for Thanksgiving. And how do you do this? Well, with a device called a turkey caller. This device, which in the ride story helps round up the turkeys, allows for this to be a shooting dark ride with targets that activate several effects. It's pretty much like one of those classic Ghost Blasters rides, but for Thanksgiving. And actually, the ride was made by Sally Dark Rides, the masterminds behind those Ghost Blasters rides. Now, the premise is already pretty wacky. You go around and find turkeys before shooting them, of course not killing them yet. I mean, let's be realistic, the family's not exactly inviting them to the dinner table. Actually, they are. I took another look at this ride's POV, and it turns out the big twist at the end is that Thanksgiving dinner is actually pizza, and that the turkeys are guests at the table, which is honestly pretty wholesome. So overall, while the very concept of a Thanksgiving dark ride where you use blasters to call turkeys is pretty strange, I wouldn't call this ride disturbing at all. For the most part, there is one thing I want to mention, and that's this animatronic character named Granny Abigail. Although everyone else is pretty much a cartoon character, Granny Abigail is extremely realistic. So realistic that she's honestly kind of uncanny. So much so that I would honestly pay good money for a Five Nights at Granny Abigail's game. Overall though, the reason this is number 10 on my list is because there are a lot stranger rides coming up. For example, there's this really unexpected educational dark ride in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And this is Shipyard Ride at Titanic Belfast, a self-guided museum. This is a dark ride based on the Titanic. Not the Titanic sinking or even the Titanic's voyage, but the building of the Titanic. You see, Belfast is actually where the Titanic was built. So at Titanic Belfast, there are several exhibits, and one of them is a dark ride. On this ride, passengers board ride vehicles suspended from the ceiling that can raise and lower. The course takes them through a recreation of the Harland & Wolff shipyard where Titanic was built. And along the way, there is an audio narration discussing what it was like to build the Titanic from the perspective of a worker. They talk about putting the engines in, hammering in the rivets, and even launching the ship. And the way that the vehicles raise and lower, well, I think stage1.co.uk puts it best. The rise and fall of the cars allows passengers to fly through, quote, the bowels of the mighty ship. It really is a fascinating dark ride system that I'm surprised we don't see more of. Now, it's definitely not the only ride to use this kind of system, but still, the fact that it's a Titanic-themed dark ride really makes it stand out and makes it a truly unique and unusual attraction. Now, shockingly enough, this is not the only transportation-based educational dark ride on this list, because there's an even stranger one in the Netherlands. This one is called Stalen Monsters, or Steel Monsters in English, and it was suggested by viewer Jarmoli Brand 2005. Now this ride operates at the Railway Museum in the Dutch city of Utrecht, and because it's at a railway museum, this ride is all about locomotives. You basically go through this big railway environment, you get some insight on what the workers do, and you actually get to check out several real steam engines. And as for the ride system itself, there's some pretty innovative elements. In addition to a few turntables, there's actually a drop track. Sort of. There's this really weird moment where you approach a coal furnace, and inside the coal furnace, some guy pops up and says, "Hey!" Then after a few seconds, you drop downwards. It's not exactly a thrilling freefall, but more like a quick descent. And then you can actually see the underside of the locomotive as you pass beneath it. This whole ride is unique and extremely memorable, but here's the kicker. The ride system was actually manufactured by Kumbach. Yes, the same exact Kumbach that made those infamous SLC trains that I've talked about a few times before. Stalen Monsters was actually their only dark ride that they ever made. And it's honestly a pretty good effort from what I've seen. Now, one more thing worth noting, this ride actually used to have infamous animatronics in its queue. These characters, known as Grandpa Homers and his grandson, debuted with the ride in 2005. However, the animatronics were soon turned off because apparently they scared small children. After sitting unactivated for several years, the animatronics were actually removed in 2020 when the ride was renovated. And get this, the museum actually posted a video of the removal on their YouTube page. And instead of scaring small children, it just scares everyone. Good God. Now let's move on before I give you nightmares for Christmas. Next up is a suggestion from Skyrush Fanboy, and that's Pistolaro Roundup at Family Kingdom Amusement Park in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now, according to several sources, this was actually the first shooting dark ride made by Sally Dark Rides, and it actually has a fascinating history. This ride actually was built inside of a former Mexican restaurant. And as for the story, the plot involves a federal agent asking guests to help him chase a group of bandits who stole gold. Now, the animatronic of the federal agent is pretty unsettling. He's got this big cartoonish face with this giant mustache that seems to have a mind of its own. But on the ride, most of the characters are actually caricatures of Mexican bandits with sombreros on. What's interesting is that the only other 3D character during the ride is this woman playing a guitar. And perhaps the most infamous aspect of this ride is the ability to shoot her skirt off. I'm not kidding. This ride was definitely a relic of its time in many ways. But nevertheless, it is very interesting to see where Sally got their start and how they evolved into the dark ride giant they are today. Another thing I want to note is that there's pretty much a clone of this ride in Frontier City in Oklahoma. Except over there, it's called Quick Draw, and it wasn't built into a Mexican restaurant, so it's not quite as interesting. But still, I also want to shout out N8N Awesome for recommending that version of the ride as well. Alright, now up next, we're heading to France for Bayou de Chikapas at Mer de Sable. Now this ride is an indoor boat ride that takes you through a tropical paradise full of anthropomorphic monkeys. But what's really interesting about the characters is that although they move, they aren't really animatronics, rather they're marionettes. You can actually see the strings on each character hanging from the ceiling on devices to move them. So they can walk around with nothing attaching their legs to the ground. It's really a fascinating use of technology that really brings more life to these characters. They actually look like walking characters brought to life. The scenery is also really detailed, and I'm surprised that this ride doesn't really get talked about a lot because it really deserves it. I'm not sure if any other dark rides use this marionette technology, but this ride does it to the full extent. Now, I already think the POV videos are awesome, but I'm sure that experiencing this ride in person is a whole nother experience. Even more so, the sheer amount of characters on this ride is just mind-boggling. There's so many different scenes, so many characters, and you can really tell that the people who made this ride put a lot of time and effort into it. And while I would consider this ride quote-unquote strange for how just jarring the effects are, I'd say it's strange in a good way. The best way, even. Apparently, this ride and its puppets were designed by famous French puppeteer Jean-Claude Dehix. It just goes to show that when you research beyond your country, you can find a lot of creative genius. So with that said, I highly recommend booking your ticket for Mer de Sable. Alright, now next up, we're going to be talking about Piccolo Mondo at Germany's Europa Park. This is one of the most famous theme parks on Earth, and yet I haven't really seen anyone talk about this ride. Surprisingly, its name translates to small world in English, but it's nothing like It's a Small World. This ride is entirely about Italy and Italian culture, but its tone is extremely cartoonish and surreal. So here's a quick summary. After passing some wine barrels, you enter the city of Pisa. Its population is a bunch of cats, and you actually see the Leaning Tower of Pizza. No, not the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Leaning Tower of Pizza, consisting of pizza and breadsticks. Definitely the most delicious piece of architecture I've ever seen. Afterwards, you enter the workshop of Leonardo da Vinci, except he's a dog. All the while, the statue of David is being built in the background, though they didn't get to his more private part. After passing through a theater, you encounter a mini version of Venice, complete with canals, gondolas, and for some reason it's lined with ice cream cones. Afterwards, you enter what looks like a tunnel of love, and at the end of it, you have this dog serenading a cat on a balcony. After a quick scene involving pigs and donkeys, you enter a pizza store called Pizza Pronto, where a dog character is balancing two pizzas while one is on his face. Immediately after this, though, it's a whiplash, as you enter the Carnival of Venice, and there's this one jester character who for some reason is hooked up to a bunch of strings. Then to finish the ride up, you enter a gelato store, and with that, the ride's complete. As someone of Italian descent, I have to say, I love this. I love everything about it. And as surreal as it is, there is a lot of charm to it, and I'd expect nothing less out of Europa Park, honestly. But now we're gonna go from something charming to something a lot scarier. This is Kyöpelinvuoren Hotel at Finland's Linnanmäki. Now, this is a classic ghost train style ride that is themed to a hotel for witches. Now, I wasn't able to find a lot of information about the story on this ride, but there are a lot of interesting visual scenes. There's a scene where a witch gets into a magical battle with a wizard. There's a scene where this really creepy distorted witch comes from the ceiling. There's this screen-based jump scare where you walk in on witches making a potion. And then there's this rather interesting scene where you just walk in on witches in the sauna. This ride is just nuts. And it's honestly one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. There are just so many European dark rides that nobody has heard of that I think deserve a lot more attention. And speaking of European dark rides, we're heading over to Italy for School. Yes, a dark ride called School at a park called Etnaland. Now this definitely has one of the most unique ride systems I've ever seen on a dark ride. Basically, it's a dark ride combined with like a quiz show. Each ride vehicle is themed to a wooden school desk, and each row is given 3 buttons, A, B, and C. During the ride, you'll come across several questions relating to Italian history. For example, you're asked to identify this flower, which in real life was discovered by an Italian botanist. And depending on what answer you give and whether you're correct or incorrect, you get a different effect. Now you're being asked these questions by ghosts, and if you get one wrong, they say things like, you don't know? Shame on you! In Italian, of course. It's actually a brilliant ride system. It's got this really ominous atmosphere, and you're just being asked questions by these ghosts and expected to get them right or else. Definitely one of the most creative dark rides, probably of all time. And big thanks to Sunjai for recommending. And now we've got a very strange ride that doesn't have any animatronics or set pieces at all. This ride is called Azura at Germany's Schwabenpark. Now, instead of animatronics and scenery, this ride is just water. Specifically, dancing, colorful water jets. It is a surreal, psychedelic experience for sure. Imagine taking a boat through the World of Color night show at Disney's California Adventure. In all honesty though, this is pretty cool. Yeah, there's no animatronics, but if I ever visited Schwabenpark, I'd be very interested to check this out. Alright, now finally, we're taking a look at a suggestion from my guy, QDude24. Now, imagine this. A ghost train ride themed to workplace safety. Now this dark ride is called Geisterbahn, which is ghost train in English, and it exists at DASA, which is an exhibition on the working world built by the National Authority for Work Protection and Health in 1993. Now, this place boasts having several different exhibits and attractions, including a dark ride. Now, the dark ride itself is pretty unsettling. You enter several different dark rooms, each representing a different workplace safety violation. One of the first things you see is an overloaded shelf structure that tips over towards the guests, and along with it, there's text that says, "Too much in it." Then there's a scene with blinking red and green lights that says, "Too fast." Up next, a steel beam collapses, and there's a stack of steel coils, followed by text saying, "Incorrectly stored." Finally, there's a room covered with workplace safety signs. I never thought, at least before today, that I would ever see a dark ride themed to workplace accidents. And surprisingly, it works so well because workplace accidents are an extremely scary and very real thing. One of these days, I really want to do a tour of Germany. It's such a huge country with tons of different attractions, and I'll be sure to set aside a day to check this out. So while that's it for today, again, don't be surprised if you see more videos like this in 2025. So with that said, this is Peter from Theme Park Crazy, and I'll see you all soon.